In September 1957, Ford Motor Company unveiled what it believed would be the boldest new car of the decade. The company poured about $250 million into its development, an enormous investment at the time, and expectations couldn't have been higher. But the launch quickly turned into one of the biggest failures in automotive history. Sales collapsed, public reaction was lukewarm, and within just 3 years the car disappeared from the market. That car was the Ford Edsel, a powerful reminder that even the biggest companies can misread the market and introduce the right idea at exactly the wrong time. The gap Ford could not ignore. To understand why the Edsel existed, you have to look at the American auto market of the early 1950s. Post-war America was booming. Suburbs were expanding, highways were stretching across the country, and car ownership symbolized prosperity. At the time, Ford's lineup had a structural weakness. The company primarily offered two divisions: Ford, which catered to entry-level buyers, and Lincoln, which served the luxury market. There was little in between. Meanwhile, General Motors had perfected what it called the ladder of success. Customers could start with Chevrolet, then move up incrementally to Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and ultimately Cadillac. As incomes rose, GM retained customers within its ecosystem. Ford executives were watching buyers climb that ladder straight out of Ford dealerships and into GM showrooms. In 1948, internal discussions began about creating a mid-priced brand to plug this gap. The project, initially called the E-Car for experimental, was meant to capture ambitious Americans who had outgrown their basic Ford but weren't ready for a Lincoln. The concept made strategic sense. The execution would not. Research without restraint. Ford treated the Edsel project like a moonshot. The company partnered with the Bureau of Applied Social Research at Columbia University to conduct in-depth consumer studies. Hundreds of interviews were conducted in cities like Peoria, Illinois, and San Bernardino, California. Psychologists analyzed buyer aspirations and emotional triggers. Marketing consultants attempted to define what a medium-priced car should represent socially and psychologically. For the 1950s, this level of research was extraordinary. Yet this flood of data created an illusion of certainty. Ford believed it had scientifically engineered demand. In reality, it had gathered opinions, many of which would not translate into actual purchasing behavior. The naming process was equally elaborate. Over 6,000 names were considered. Poet Marianne Moore submitted creative suggestions, though none were used. Ultimately, executives chose to honor Edsel Ford, Henry Ford's son, who had died in 1943. Not everyone approved. Members of the Ford family reportedly disliked using Edsel's name for a commercial product. Worse still, consumer testing showed the name Edsel performed poorly. Respondents associated it with awkward or unpleasant-sounding words. Ford pressed ahead anyway. It was the first sign that internal conviction was overriding external feedback. Styling that divided America. If the name sparked concern, the design ignited controversy. The most striking feature of the Edsel was its vertical oval grille. At a time when most American cars wore wide horizontal grilles, the Edsel's tall central opening was unlike anything on the road. Ford designers believed it would signal bold modernity. Many consumers disagreed. The grille was compared, sometimes politely, often not, to everything from horse collars to anatomical features. Rather than appearing futuristic, it struck many as awkward and overly dramatic. The rest of the car didn't help. Chrome trim was abundant. Decorative elements felt busy. Arrow-shaped taillights confused some drivers. Inside, the push-button transmission controls were mounted in the steering wheel hub, a novel idea that led to accidental gear changes when drivers attempted to honk the horn. Innovation became irritation. Distinctive design can be an asset, but in the conservative, status-conscious car market of the 1950s, polarizing aesthetics were risky. For a brand-new nameplate trying to win trust, it was even riskier. A launch into recession. Perhaps the most damaging factor in the Edsel's collapse was timing. The car had been conceived during the prosperous mid-1950s. At that time, Americans favored large, flamboyant vehicles with powerful V8 engines and dramatic styling. The Edsel was engineered for that environment. But by the time it debuted in September 1957, the US economy had entered recession. Unemployment rose. Consumer confidence fell. Buyers shifted toward practicality and affordability. The Edsel was neither modest nor inexpensive. Ford had invested heavily in dedicated marketing, dealer training, and production infrastructure. An entire new division had been formed. The company couldn't simply pivot to a smaller, more economical vehicle overnight. It was locked into a plan designed for yesterday's market. Overhyped, underwhelming. Ford's promotional campaign built enormous anticipation. Dealerships kept cars hidden under covers until official unveiling dates. Advertisements promised something revolutionary. When customers finally saw the car in person, expectations collided with reality. Automotive journalists criticized the styling. Consumer reports described the car as more conventional than advertised. Early buyers reported quality issues, and word spread quickly. The Edsel was assembled in factories that also produced Ford and Mercury models. Workers frequently shifted between production lines, and unfamiliarity with unique Edsel components led to inconsistent build quality. Some early vehicles suffered from oil leaks, transmission faults, and malfunctioning push-button systems. In the auto industry, reputation is fragile. The Edsels began cracking almost immediately. The numbers tell the story. Ford had projected first-year sales of roughly 200,000 units. In 1958, the Edsel sold about 63,000 vehicles, far below expectations. Sales dropped further in 1959, and by 1960 production had dwindled significantly. Across all three model years 1958, 1960, total production reached just over 116,000 units. On November 19, 1959, Ford announced the discontinuation of the Edsel line. Financial losses are difficult to calculate precisely, but most historians estimate the failure cost Ford between $250 million and $350 million at the time, an enormous sum in the late 1950s. It was widely regarded as the most expensive product launch failure in American business history up to that point. What actually went wrong? The Edsel did not fail because of a single flaw. It failed because multiple miscalculations converged at once. First, Ford relied heavily on consumer research, but may have asked the wrong questions. Stated preferences do not always predict real-world behavior. People often describe aspirational desires that differ from practical buying decisions. Second, economic timing shifted dramatically. A recession can upend even well-designed products. Third, the styling gamble backfired. Instead of inspiring admiration, the design provoked ridicule. Fourth, early quality problems damaged trust. First impressions in automotive markets can define a model's fate. Finally, the strategic gap Ford sought to fill was shrinking. Its own Ford and Mercury lines had expanded, leaving less room for a distinct mid-priced identity. The Edsel entered a space that was no longer clearly defined. An unexpected afterlife. Ironically, the Edsel's scarcity has made it collectible. Certain variants, such as the 1958 Citation convertible, can command six-figure prices at auction today. What was once avoided has become a curiosity, an artifact of ambition and miscalculation. The name Edsel also lives on linguistically. It is still used to describe expensive corporate flops. Few product failures have left such a lasting cultural imprint. Lessons from a $250 million gamble. The Edsel remains one of the most studied failures in business history because it demonstrates that success cannot be engineered purely through data, spending, or scale. Ford conducted unprecedented research. It invested enormous capital. It built infrastructure and hype. And it still failed. Markets evolve. Consumer sentiment shifts. Design risks can misfire. Even industry giants are vulnerable to overconfidence. Yet the story is not entirely tragic. The lessons learned influenced future strategies across Detroit. Competitors observed the consequences of overextension. Later manufacturers, including Japanese automakers entering the US market in the 1960s and 1970s, emphasized efficiency, reliability, and gradual brand building. In that sense, the Edsel was educational. It proved that timing matters as much as technology. That reputation can outweigh performance. and that sometimes doing everything by the book still isn't enough. The Ford Edsel was meant to revolutionize the automotive industry. Instead, it became its most famous cautionary tale. If you enjoyed uncovering the fascinating story behind the Ford Edsel and how one of the biggest car launches in history turned into one of the most famous business failures ever, then make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel.